Hello and welcome to another video tutorial on YouTube channel of tutorialsvideo.com. In this video tutorial, I will explain step by step how we can implement a RESTful web service using TIBCO BW6 Business Studio. For this video tutorial, I will be implementing a RESTful web service with two operations, one with the post and one with the get verb. And I will be using JSON and XML type of data payloads and responses in order to show you how we can utilize power of TIBCO to return or to receive any type of data format, whether it's JSON or XML. And in the backend, I will be using Oracle database to save the data and to retrieve any data from the tables in the Oracle database. Before I proceed with this tutorial, I will request you to please subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed before so that you are able to get latest videos when uploaded. So here is the use case that we are going to take into consideration for this video tutorial. We will be implementing a user management RESTful web service using BW6 Business Studio. And in the post operation, we will be accepting input requests from the client in the JSON format, and we will be saving the data into the database in a table in Oracle database. And in case of the get operation, we will be expecting a parameter, a query parameter from the client in the request. And based on the information or based on the parameter value, we will be getting the data from the database. And in this case, the response that we will be returning back to the user will be in the XML format. So this is how we will be able to see both cases, XML and JSON data in the payload and in the response. So without further ado, let's directly jump into the implementation part. I have already opened Business Studio, so I will directly jump into the part of creating the project. I will go to File, New, and I will choose Project. Here we will have to choose BusinessWorks application from the BusinessWorks section. We will click on Next and we will specify the name of the project. Let's name it as BW6 Rest Tutorial, and the module name is also same with dot module extension which gets created. And now we will click on next, and here we can make any changes. We want to have our own folder structure if we have certain template or best practices to be followed, but for the sake of simplicity here in this tutorial, I will not make any changes to the project structure, and I will just accept the default and click next. And now I will just click on finish, and once I click on finish, that in that moment you will see that in the project explorer the complete structure of the project gets created. So once the project gets created, it by default adds a process in the process folder. So we don't want this default process, so we will just delete this process as we will be implementing our own scenario. Okay, so now what we need to do, we have to implement the REST web service. Actually, in case of BW6, there are more than one ways to implement a RESTful web service. You can create a process, state test process, and then implement the REST service within that process. Or you can go with the REST module and then follow the process to create the REST web service. I will choose this option to add a new REST using this option. Right click on the project, on the package, choose new, and here you will choose BusinessWorks REST resource. So when you click on this, you will get a new window where you will be given option to uh, choose what kind of operations you want to implement, what kind of resources you want to have, and then it will follow you with the process of creating the input and output XST structure for your request. For the resource name, I will name it as user because we are going to have user management service. And here we have the resource service path, which will be slash user. In this case, I will not change it. And since we want to implement two type of operation, post and get, so I will check only these two and I will keep all others unchecked. I will click on next. Now here in this point, we will have to specify the input and output structure for our methods. You can see we have two tabs, get and post, because we selected two operations. The number of tabs here depends on the type, on the number of operations that you checked in the previous section. So for the post, we will have to specify here the request. So let me name it as request, and here instead of string, I will have to choose XST element. Before I do this, let me show you the table in the database that we are going to use for this scenario. So here is the table with the name users. It's a very simple table with only 3 columns: user ID, which is a sequence generated numeric value, and then we have username and user status. Username and user status are varchar, so we will be considering them as string. So I will switch back to Business Studio, and now for the post operation, I will create the XST structure for the request. So here I will choose XST element. Since we don't have XST already created, so we will have to choose this option, create new schema. And here we will specify what kind of elements we want in this schema. Let's change this element name to user. And inside the user, we want username. We want it to be of type string, and we will just click OK. And then we want user status. This one also we want to be in the string format, and right now it shows optional, but we want to make it mandatory, so min value will be 1. And this flag which automatically gets added, we will just remove it because we want only username and user status as an input, because user ID will be sequence generated. Okay, so based on this, we will specify now what kind of response we want to return back for this post operation. So let me change this name to response. And again, there are two options for response. For a post operation, you can respond either just with the status code, the standard HTTP status code. As in case of post, normally we use 201, which means created, and in case of get, it's 200, which means that it's okay response for the happy scenario. But in our case, we want to return the user ID, because once the post operation will be invoked with the JSON payload for the user will be added into the database, and the ID of the user will be sequence generated. So whatever is the ID of the user, we want to return that as a response to the client, so that client can use it for further processing or to call the get operation. So for that purpose, we will use XST element here, and for the response, we will create a new schema. You can create one schema in general and put the request and response elements and then specify the sub elements there. But in our case, let's create a new schema for response. So we will choose this create option, and we will name it as response schema. And in the response schema, we will have the root element with the name response. And here we are going to specify response code. Response code, I want to make it integer value, and the second element I want is response message, and let's put it min occur 0, which means it will be optional, but it will also be a string. And in case of flag, we will rename it just to user reference, and this user reference will be returning whatever the ID of the user is created in the database, and it will be type integer, and subtype will be long, because the ID can be long. So we will keep it optional because it will be sent only in the happy scenarios whenever we have successfully added. In our case, in this tutorial, for the sake of simplicity, we will only consider happy scenario. We will not do any exception handling, and we will assume that anytime user sends a request, a valid request, and the record gets added. So we will click on OK. So now we have request and response structure specified for our post operation. In the same way, we will go for the get operation, and here we have to specify the response, because in case of get, we don't have a request payload, we have only response. So let's name it as response. And what kind of response we want to send? We will choose XST element, and we want to send back user as a response. So we will choose user element from the schema that we previously created, and we will click next. So now here we will not make any changes to the process name. The process name will be user, and this will be the package, and this will be the process folder. So we will just click on finish. So once we will click on finish, you will see that a process with the name user will get created in our project, and it will have both operations. Okay, so we can see that we have a process created with the name user.bwp, and we have user slash post and user slash get. Both operations are there, and inside these we have to do the actual implementation. So only considering the happy scenario, we will just assume that everything works fine. So we will not do any exception handling, and we will directly start implementing the required JDBC activities to post the data or to save the data in database, and also for the get operation to query the data from the database. Okay, for the post operation, since we want to have a user ID as sequence generated, and we also want this user ID to be returned as a response, so I will have to add a JDBC query first, where I will create this, where I will have a query to get the ID, and then I will map that ID in the next activity as an input for the new record to be added into the database. So here in this JDBC query, let's name it as get user ID. Okay, in the configuration, we first need to have a database connection which is not available. So we will click on this binocular. Right now we don't have a JDBC connection created, so we will have to use this option create shared resource, and it will give us options to create the new connection. Let's not change the name of the connection and just click finish. And now we have to configure this connection. So we will click on this edit resource, and once you click on this edit, you will have options to do the configuration for your connection. So for the connection, we will choose the connection type as direct, and here we will have to specify username and password. I have Express Edition running, Oracle Express Edition running in my machine, so I will connect to that. Let me specify the password for the system user. And now here we have to select the database driver. Since we are using Oracle, so I will choose this Oracle driver. And now I will have to configure this connection. I will have to specify host. In my case, host is localhost. I will have to specify port. Port is 1521, and the service name is XE in my case. Okay, now to verify that connections configuration is correct, I will click on this test connection, and I will see if everything is fine, we get the successful response. So you can see here I got the message that successfully connected to Oracle. This means that connection configuration is fine. Okay, I will switch back to the process, and now I will have to do I'll have to write the query for this get user ID. So I will go to this statement, and here I will have to write the required query. So I'll select, let me get the name of the sequence. The sequence that we are using for this table is this seek underscore u underscore id. So I will use select seek underscore u underscore id dot next val from dual. So this is the way we get the next value from a sequence, and I will click on this fetch button here, and if the query is correct, then we see the response in the output, the possible response. So we can see here next val. This means that we have written our query correctly. Okay, once we have this, the next thing that we need to do is to add the JDBC update activity, where we will write our insert statement. So we will right click add activity, we will go to JDBC palette, and we will choose JDBC update activity. Okay, let me connect it with the transition from JDBC previous JDBC query to this one, and I will connect it to the post out. Okay, for this JDBC update, I will rename it to save user. So I'm giving it name save user. Connection is already selected. I will go to the statement tab, and here I will have to write the insert statement. I will write insert into the name of the table is users. I will have to specify the columns user underscore ID, user underscore name, user underscore status, and then I will write values. And since it's a dynamic query, dynamic statement, so I will add 3 question marks here. When I add 3 question marks, it means that this statement insert statement is expecting 3 parameters. So I will go to parameter section, I will click this plus button 3 times. So you can name these parameters anything, but it's better that you name them same as the name of the columns. So I will write as user ID. User ID is a numeric. So in the type, we need to select numeric. Okay, the second one is user underscore name, and the third element is user underscore status. Username and status are varchar in database, so we will choose same here. Okay, so now we will go to the input tab, and here we need to map what values we want to pass as parameters. So the user ID will be based on the sequence value that we are fetching in the get user ID. So I will map that, and here I will apply the filter to 1 because that will be the first value. And then username and password will be, sorry, username and status will be in the post body. So in the request, I will map this username to username, user status to user status. So this user ID, we need to click on this fixed typecasting so that it's typecasted to the correct value. Sorry, this map is wrong. I need to specify like this. Okay, so it's now correct. Okay, so this is how this record will be saved into the database. Now in the output, post out, we will be returning the response code. Let's stick to the actual response code that normally is for the HTTP case for the post, which is 201. So we will add the same here. You can have your own code agreement between the client that in case of success we will be passing, for example, 0 or 100 or whatever it is. But for now, for this tutorial, I will make it 201, and response message will be user added successfully. So this is the message that we want to return. And here user reference, we want to map the user ID so that client receive the same user ID by which the record has been saved into the database. So here I will put the filter as 1, and I will click on this typecasting, so it will be casted to long because we specified it as long in our schema. Okay, this is the implementation for the post operation, a basic simple implementation without any exception handling. Now we will do the similar thing for the get operation. For the get case, we will right click and we will use add activity. We will go to JDBC and we will add JDBC query because we want to query the data from the database. Let me put the transitions. And for this JDBC query, I will rename it to get user. Connection is already selected, so I will directly go to the statement, and here I will use select static from user table. So let me go to the table. The name, sorry, it's not user, it's users, where user underscore id is equal to question mark. Why question mark? Because we want to query from the database based on the input query parameter user id. So in the parameter type, we will click on this plus button and we will name this parameter as user underscore id. We will change this one to numeric. But there is an important thing. So far, for the request, we haven't specified this user ID query parameter. So we need to go to our module, and in the component section, we need to go to our user resource. And here we need to go to the binding tab and do all the needful changes here. Okay, so for the response, I will choose both JSON and XML because in one case, in case of get, we want to pass the response in XML format. So here we have operation post and get. For the post, if you go to the request section, it says the request will be in JSON format, and we want to keep it in JSON format. But for the post response, we don't want to return the response with the status code only, rather we want to return the whole response. So we will uncheck this. Okay, so we have unchecked this one. Now if you see, the response will be in this format as we specified in our schema. Similarly, for the get operation, in the request parameters, query and header parameter, we will have to use this option to add query parameter, and let's name it as user ID. The type is integer. Let's put it long, and we say it's not repeating, and in the required tab we will specify yes, because we want to make it mandatory. Okay, so we have one parameter with the name user ID for the request, and for the response of get operation, again we don't want to respond with status code only, we want full response. So we will uncheck this, and now we will have to specify, we already specified the response, which is the user. So username and user status will be returned as a response, and here we are not going to specify any response status because we are not going to respond based on the status codes. So this is how we do the required configuration for the binding, and I will just save it. There is some mismatch in the process because of checking and unchecking the status code. So I will have to go here and make the required corrections. Let me go to the input. Because it's adding the status code, which, okay, let's do one thing. We want to return the status code as well, just to show you how we return status codes. So status code, if we specify here, in case of post status code, the standard HTTP status code is 201. If we specify here, okay, let me remove this one. In the input editor, this items got added, which we don't want, and we just remove it. And even if status, we have two options, either we keep the status or we remove it. So if we want to remove it, we can remove it from here, and now the error is gone. So we have two options, either to map the status code, but in that case we have to define the status code, or else we can just delete it. So the response will be response code that we added as our on in our on custom schema, response message and user reference. So we just save it. And now let's go back to this get user, and in the user ID, since we already defined the parameter, so we will choose user ID and map it to user ID. This is going to be the user request, and after that we will be receiving the response. Let me go to the statement and click on this fetch button. So this fetch button will show us the possible output in the output tab. So the output, possible output, is user ID, username and user status. So now we go to the get out. Again, here in the input editor, let me just remove this item because we don't want to pass this item element. It got added because when we were doing the changes in the binding, we checked and unchecked certain elements. Because of that it got added, but we can remove it from here. Now we go to the input tab, and for the user we want to take the first record. Here we will specify record 1 because we want to pick the first record, and from that record we want to map username to username, and we want to map user status to user status. So in this way we have our both operations implemented, get and post operation. And right now if you go to the problems, we don't have any problem with our process, so it's fine. Okay, now you just need to run this and do the testing. I will right click and I will choose the option run businessworks application. So it's launching. So in the console we will see that after taking certain amount of time, the process will get loaded and it will be running in the app space, and then we will be able to test it. So let's wait for a few seconds till the time it gets loaded and it starts running in the business studio, and then we will test it. So as you can see now that we have the process running, the project has successfully loaded and it's running in the app space. So we have command lrest doc. If we run this command, it will give us the endpoint URL for our RESTful web service. And now using this URL, we can go to our browser and we can call the operations for our RESTful web service. So let's copy this and go to any browser. I will go to the browser and I will just open this URL, and it will open the Swagger UI for our project. And as you can see, the BW6 REST tutorial, and it has one resource with an user, and it has two operations, get user and post user. So let's one by one run both and see that it's working fine or not. So we will click on post. First we want to add a new user, and then same user we will use the get operation to query. So it shows us the sample, what kind of input it expects. So we will just click on this sample and it adds the required JSON format for the user. And username we want to specify is let's add David, and status inactive. Just to show you, we specify the status as inactive. And if we click on this tryout, the request will go to the web service. So it's running, and let's see the response. You can see we got a response with us response code 201. It says response message user edit successfully, and this is the user reference. User reference 3 means that this is the ID of the user that has been added. We can go to the table and we can verify that the user has been added or not. So let's go to the table, user table, and go to the data, and you can see that this user David has been added with the ID 3 and status inactive. Now let's call the get operation and see that we get the response or not for this user. So we will click on this user get operation, and here it specifies the option to provide the user ID for which we want to get the data. So let's add 3 and click on this try it out, and you can see that we got the response user name David and user status inactive. But you see that the response is in JSON format. We want the response in XML format. So for that we will have to make change to our project. Let's go to the components. So if we want to return the response in XML format, we will go to the resource, and in the binding for the get operation under the response, we will change the format to allow only XML. So we will remove this JSON. So in this way, now the response will be only in XML format for this get operation. Let's save it. So in the process, there is something broken. Let me go to the process. If you go to the out operation, again it added the item element unnecessarily. We want to remove this. We want to remove this status line also. Okay, so now we have the input as the response that we receive from the get user. So let's now load it again. Right click and run BusinessWorks application. So it will start loading, and once it has been loaded, we will try it again. Okay, so the project has been loaded again and now it's running. So let's go to the browser, and again we use the Swagger UI. Let me refresh it. Okay, so here now we will specify the request user ID. Let's put 3 and try it out. And if we see here, that we can see that now the response we received is in XML format with the username David and status inactive. We have another user in the database with the ID 1 with the name Ajmal. If we try it out, we receive the response for the user 1. So in this way, we can change the response type from XML to JSON and JSON to XML. So that's it from this tutorial on BW6 REST API. I hope that this will be helpful for you, although it's very basic, but still it serves the purpose of explaining the fundamentals and the power of TIBCO BW6 for implementation of RESTful web services. And again, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I will try to cover advanced topics as well in the future. Thank you.